sort of funny way to start this. There's these imaginary figures I want you to imagine. I'm going to be introducing them. I'm going to suggest that they come on up because you want to know who they are. We might be talking about the metaverse tonight, but we're also here in person, and there's these wonderful people here. So let me get started. Note how the knowledge is in my little device. So immediately to my left, we have David Chalmers, who is a university professor of philosophy and neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. He is the author, as you may know, of The Conscious Mind, Constructing the World, and most recently, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problem of Philosophy. He is known for formulating the, quote, hard problem of consciousness, which inspired Tom Stoppard's play, The Hard Problem, and for the idea of the extended mind, which says that the tools we use can become parts of our minds. Next up, we have Dr. Lee Francis IV, who is an Albuquerque-based activist, educator, and comic creator. He is also the executive director of WordCraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers, owner and CEO of Native Realities Publishing, and founder of the Indigenous Comic-Con and Red Planet Books and Comics. Dr. Francis is an award-winning poet and writer whose work revolves around education and how Native peoples and Indigenous communities are represented in popular culture. And finally, the reason we're actually all here tonight, we have John Mack, who is an artist, photographer, author, lecturer, and the founder of the nonprofit initiative Life Calling, whose mission is to foster awareness and balance for society in the digital age. Mack is a 2022 honoree of the Explorers Club 50 people changing the world, who the world needs to know about. Mack has recently published 2 books, A Land Between Worlds, The Shifting Poetry of the Great American Landscape, and Notes to Selfie, Bits of Truth in a Phony World. Additionally, Mack serves as a board member of Fair Play, an organization that strives to create a world where kids can be kids, free from the false promises of marketers and manipulations of big tech. Hear, hear. He has served as an adjunct lecturer for the graduate program of design at the University of Lisbon, and he currently lives between London and Seville. And here we all are in New York. So thank you all for joining us. The panel tonight is, can the metaverse be meaningful? And so I thought maybe just to get us started, since words like metaverse and meaning get thrown around and we all pretend we know what we're talking about, that I would ask the panelists if they might just tell us, when they use the word metaverse, what do you mean by that? What is it that you're trying to express to whoever your audience is?
I'll jump in. When I use the word metaverse, I mean it psychologically. How I see Meta's metaverse, it is merely the digital manifestation of our own artifice that we have running in the psyche device. So the metaverse has existed since the ages of when we thought thoughts were real. Since thought has replaced reality, construct has replaced reality, we are constantly projecting that reality in our minds over the natural world. So perception, the veil of perception that we all have, whether it's belief or ideologies that we have assumed to be true about ourselves and the things we see, is already a metaverse. And the way I see it is that the current metaverse that we're seeing today is really just technology catching up to the inner constructs that we've always had.
Sure. Guatsi Haupa, Dawash Jawashrap. Good evening, everybody. That's the traditional greeting for the evening from my family, which is from the Pueblo of Laguna. I think for me, that metaverse is, so a lot of the work that I talk around in terms of representation and popular culture, you know, and technology and all of these intersections around all these, around when they, how they all come together in this sort of confluence. I think it's that technological, I think it's brilliant, I think it's the technological mirage and how we navigate our ways through that. So I think that there's, you know, it's the meta understanding of all these pieces that sort of spike up into that particular space. And I'm very much influenced by this exhibit right now, if you couldn't tell, about how it plays off of both the real world, this technological world, and these images and representations of both our inner selves and everything that comes together from all of the influences of the outer world upon our own identities.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. I'm a philosopher, so I like defining my terms. Metaverse has actually interestingly changed in meaning, I think, over time. I mean, the term comes originally from Neil Stephenson's 1992 science fiction novel, Snow Crash, where the metaverse was a single, kind of all-encompassing virtual world. A virtual world I take to be an immersive, interactive, computer-generated world. So to say it's immersive is to say it's present all around you, with you at the center. To say it's interactive is to say you interact with it. But the key property of a virtual world and of the metaverse is that it's computer-generated. It's a digital world that you experience very much like you experience the physical world all around you. I mean, the physical world is immersive and interactive too, but you know, as far as we know, it's not computer-generated. I mean, there have been some hypotheses. If you follow the simulation hypothesis, there are people who think we're actually in a metaverse already. But otherwise, the metaverse is a computer-generated world that we create. Stephenson said the metaverse was a single giant virtual world on like a virtual planet with this virtual street on which everything's centered. These days, I think, you know, the metaverse has shifted in meaning to mean something like an interconnected network of virtual worlds. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg renamed Facebook Meta out of their ambition to help build the metaverse. It won't be a single virtual world, it'll be a network of virtual worlds. Many people hope it'll be an encompassing network of virtual worlds that includes the worlds created by Meta, by Apple and other corporations, by users, by governments. In this way, the metaverse could actually come to be something of a multiverse. We all know the multiverse. It's like the cosmos of different universes. And I think that's possibly the direction in which the metaverse is going, a kind of multiverse of different virtual worlds, and then we'll face the question, can we live a meaningful life in them?
So, in different ways, you all brought up some of the strains that we want to talk about tonight, right? There's the psychological aspect of it, this notion of meta, right? Of sort of thinking the world into being, the sort of social imaginary of it. There's this element of the sort of people gathering and the kind of storytelling that happens around it. And all three of you, of course, were talking about technology. And technology, of course, is this word techne and logos, right? It's this logos of making, it's this thinking of making, reason. And so I'm wondering, what is the logos of techne that you're seeing as a part of this expanding metaverse realm that we're all observing? What are the logics that you're observing dominate and that you're seeing trying to infiltrate?
So I won't talk about the logos without speaking about eros, okay? If the logos is reason, pragmatism, thought, rationalism, evidence, witness, if we could call that, psychology would call that masculine toned energy. And we all as individuals have that in us. And we also have feminine toned energy, okay? That is the irrational, it is the communal. The logos would be the individual. What I'm seeing is that we've put so much emphasis on thought and rational processes that we have suppressed the irrational and the communal. And we're becoming so individual that we're missing the communal. Yet, deep down, we still want the communal, we still want to connect. So what are we doing? We are finding a totally rational environment based on data, which is the metaverse, as the world in which we will connect. Because real connection would mean not suppressing that feminine energy in us. And that takes, I don't want to get too abstract, that takes a death. That takes a death because you have to redo all of your psychological programming of your beliefs in reason in order to invite the irrational back into your world. And that's an extreme effort that we try to avoid for various reasons, which I guess are besides the point right now. But in order to feel like we are communal again, we are creating false universes separate from nature that are replacing, it's a masculine toned community that does not exist. That is the illusion. So what I'm seeing is I'm seeing technology again just playing a game of catch up to our imbalanced reason and addiction to data. Our worship of data, and AI is just the embodiment of that God.
I want to build off of that because I think there's, as you were speaking about that, Beth Brandt Castellano, an indigenous scholar, talks about 3 ways of being and knowing from indigenous philosophies: traditional, empirical, and revealed. And the traditional is the stories and what we bring in from our ancestors, the way that we've learned throughout our lives and whatnot. And the empirical is what we can see, the things that we can see. And the revealed is the intuited. She calls it prophecy knowledge or dream knowledge, right? And all those within, we'll say, a perfect construct. They all operate interconnectedly, simultaneously. They play off of each other. You gain knowledge almost like you're in the center of that from all 3 of those particular facets. And you can look at that from indigenous communities that still continue to practice and exist today in many of those ways. And I think the logos, I think this is exactly dead on, is that the logos overwhelm. That's not even a part of that part of the conversation. It is such a reliance on this self-closed loop of thought and superior thought. We can organize all of this into bits and bytes, and all the rest is dismissed. Traditional stories don't exist. The idea of being able to observe things and learn things from just that observation, the idea of intuitive knowledge, where does that come from? And all of those working together are thrown out the door for this piece, right? And I think because of that, what we get into is this mythology of a non-existent reality. It's the primitivism, right? So we're talking about climate chaos in this world right now. We see all these beautiful pictures and we're like, okay, what are we going to do? And so we're building a metaverse so that we can escape out of all of this chaos that we're experiencing. And how are we saying that? Well, if we can just be more like Native people, if we can just be more indigenous, because they had all the answers, right? And but we're not talking about that, because this is a balanced structure. It's this swing away from that of we can think our way out of this and be more like that. And it's a myth of what that is, of a primitivism. If we can just go back to being more primitive, like Native people, we can get to that place. But it still rests upon this masculine, this masculine type of energy of we can conquer this thing, rather than finding this balanced existence. So.
Yeah, I'm maybe a little bit more positive about digital and virtual worlds. I think the logos of a virtual world is a it from bit logos, in the words of the great physicist John Wheeler, who talked about the idea that maybe in physics, reality could ultimately come down to patterns of bits. I mean, that's controversial in the case of physics, but it actually fits technology quite well. I mean, physics, I guess standardly we think, okay, in a physical world, we have an it from atom logos ontology. We think of the physical world as constructed from like atoms. You think, okay, well, atoms are intrinsically meaningless. You don't get any meaning or any tradition or so on out of atoms alone. But it's not just a world of atoms. We have consciousness. And we bring our consciousness to the physical world. And our consciousness invests structures of atoms with meaning. And we can look around us and see so many meaningful things, meaningful structures, meaningful parts of nature, meaningful interactions, all thanks to our consciousness. We've taken meaningless atoms and constructed meaning. Well, I think we can do the same in principle with an it from bit logos. Bits are intrinsically meaningless. They're just meaningless things. But we can bring our consciousness to a digital world, to a world of bits, and invest that with meaning, and build traditions, and build connections. And in principle, I think we can do that as well in a virtual world as in the physical world. I don't know how many of you saw the recent documentary, We Met in Virtual Reality, that documents some people who met in the virtual world of VR chat and actually built very meaningful communities there, for different kinds of communities, for example, with different challenges, and people actually built relationships here that met in, say, in marriage in the physical world. So I think there's nothing intrinsically about a digital world that makes it less meaningless or less real than a physical world. They're just different forms of reality, and it doesn't mean it's utopia. None of this is utopia, but whether it's good or bad is wholly a matter of what we make of it.
Go ahead.
Could I just, ask you a question? When you say we bring consciousness to things, when you say the word consciousness there, is that synonymous to thought?
Consciousness is not just thought. Consciousness for me is subjective experience, and there are many layers of consciousness. Perception is a level of consciousness far more primitive than thought. You mentioned intuition. That's absolutely part of consciousness. Emotion, that's part of consciousness. Thought is another part of consciousness, but it's not the only part.
But I wonder if, But I wonder if I can sort of bring here, because across the three of you, there are sort of two ways that we're going to have to hit on. One has to do with what are we confronting in a tangible sense, right? Both in terms of thinking and in terms of like actually dealing with things in a metaverse, right? That has to do with the bits, as it were. But the other part of it is when you brought up consciousness, and some of the thing that all of you are sort of getting around is this notion of the social imaginary, right? That when you talk about consciousness, often consciousness sort of lands us in this way of thinking about like my consciousness, right? It's an individual consciousness. And I think one of the things that is sort of usefully brought forward by theories of social imaginary is the way in which meaning is produced in these through social gatherings, and then the way in which we produce those meanings develops the world that the society then participates in. So in that way, the community of a space, and to speak about like these people who met in a metaverse and who were, then developed these communities, they developed systems of meaning, ways of interacting, social behaviors, what we sometimes call netiquette, right, and these different things. So one of the things that concerns me is how those social constructs are being delimited by the technology itself, right? So like what options are available when the space you're in is designed in this particular kind of way? And so in that sense, to what degree are these societies that are forming within their own sense of the ability to bring in traditions or bring in other cultural values or bring in the places they're coming from? And to what degree do they have to abandon those because the structure itself that's being designed around them doesn't permit for those kinds of interactions?
Is it an evolution or a disassociation? I think is kind of where we're at, right? Is it an evolution that we're saying we're taking this next step into this, world and, that we may be already experiencing, in terms of the bits and bytes and all the rest of that? Or is it, we're trying to escape the disassociation? It's like, well, we can go into this metaverse and we can live the lives we've always wanted. We can be in these spaces that we've always wanted to exist in. I can have an avatar. I can have, I can fly. I can have superpower, whatever, right? So I think there's something, I don't know if that's clarifying or if that's something kind of where...
Well, I wonder if maybe I can give just a very concrete example, right? So boundaries around objects in virtual realities determine whether you can move through the object, right? So if you are in certain social VRs, you can just move through each other. And in others, you can't. If you can move through another avatar, that produces an entirely different type of social interaction and a whole set of questions around how are we engaging with each other that requires thought and creates confusion. I've been in these social situations where people discover that they can run through someone else's avatar. You don't experience it as the avatar yourself. It's just all of a sudden there's someone in front of you, right? There's no physical pain. There's no, all the reasons we have for certain types of distance and relationship to each other, all the different types of that kind of social formulation have to do with our physical body, right? Where that is abandoned in these social VR spaces, is it okay to move through somebody? People don't know what they think. And so one, I just want to sort of put out there, isn't it interesting that we are trying to use creative imagination that is a part of building and designing technology to reproduce this world rather than actually engaging what potentially this other bit world could allow us to begin to think through metaphysically, sociopolitically, and so forth. So I want to ask, since all of you are coming from different positions, what your takes on that are.
I think there's one thing that virtual worlds let us do is create so many, it's this multiverse of different worlds with different laws and different norms. So one thing you can do is try and create a world which is as much like the physical world as possible and which replicates every aspect of that. And then, of course, you're going to want to, okay, let's make sure our bodies don't get too close, except in certain very narrowly delineated circumstances, because we have those norms in the physical world. But we also see that virtual worlds, you can have different norms in virtual worlds, that is different social norms, but they get more radically different than that. You can also have different laws of nature in a virtual world. In a physical world, our bodies just can't pass through each other in this way. So I think many virtual worlds have just adopted norms where, okay, it's okay for our bodies to pass through each other, and it doesn't mean, whatever it means, it doesn't mean anything like it would mean in a physical world, and that's
But the
and that's
desire
somehow
to
okay.
do that, to do that is to express a set of social values that we have out here around wanting already to reproduce what is here, right? So in that sense, we are bringing into the metaverse, into these virtual reality spaces, values from this world. And I think that what I'm trying to bring out is the fact that we are doing that in ways that we aren't necessarily always thinking through, right? So that's significant, that's a cultural value, and it's just rampant across the metaverse, and that wasn't a conversation that happened, right? Is that something we want in a virtual reality for it to replicate?
I think what I'm saying is we actually have the choice, and people have had the choice. Some people, like Meta, have chosen to import that cultural value about boundaries between bodies into the physics and the norms of their corner of the metaverse, but other people, say in VR chat, have basically rejected that as a norm, and whatever. I mean, everything goes through everything in this world, and we don't need to import that bit of cultural baggage from the physical universe. Why? Because virtual universes work in a quite different way.
I would just like to remind everybody that expansiveness of virtual worlds and realities and the metaverse exists within the confines of a microchip. So we can be up here and talk about all of this expansion and is this ethical or not, and I just want to say that the way I see it is, we're speaking about what is ethical in a prison. Personally, I'd rather say, is a prison ethical? Not how we act in the prison. Is the prison itself ethical? Because the paradigm that we are living now on this planet is one of mixed reality. That means the more expansive the metaverse, the more infinite, we're actually in a tighter prison. We see it here in this country. A democracy, censorship, we don't allow that. You can't burn books. What's the new censorship? Flood the market with garbage books so you can't find the essential books. Give them more freedom to tighten the prison. And all of this metaverse stuff and all of this talk, as far as I'm concerned, is how should we behave in a prison? So, sorry, just wanted to...
And I want to add to that because I think there's a component of who is designing the prison. So as you're talking about, we're taking the rules and the norms and everything else. Your fundamental question in this is, it's still based on programming. It's still based on a microchip. Somebody beyond this. Now we can get really into the philosophies of that. Is maybe there's something beyond us that has already done. We'll just talk about this tonight. This idea of who's the creator of the prison? Who's the creator of these metaverses? Who is determining these coding pieces that go in there? Because I don't know if it's not a social construct. It's somebody decided you can pass through. That wasn't determined by the community. So that is very different than the way that we've evolved as humans in terms of the stories, in terms of the social constructs and everything that we pulled together, because somebody else has to go and rewire that. They've got to add a language to that.
I want to add to that and point out that, because maybe we can push this a little bit further, in Australia, earlier this year, I think it came out in April, there was a white paper that got published by two lawyers from the Digital Law Association and two representatives from the indigenous tribes that basically wanted to discuss the way in which the very notion of the metaverse having private spaces was to reiterate a type of colonial land grab. Because the notion of space, of an environment from their Aboriginal, indigenous histories and cultures was one that was shared. It did not belong to one person or to one group. It was one through which all could move. And so to have something like Meta, or to have any of these privatized, corporatized metaverse spaces was basically to reinstantiate a colonial land grab. And I think what's really important about this is because we talk about this space, right? We talk about these environments, and this is what I'm trying to sort of keep digging out, is the way in which even the act of it being private is to reiterate a type of values thinking, right? And what they're proposing is basically they've established a nonprofit to create a cultural embassy in the metaverse as an effort to be able to express their values into this space. We see this, and I'm moved by their argument, and I'm baffled how to fight, like how to push that. Like, why is the metaverse private at all? Mm-hmm. Right? To your point, John, all our parks are now private controlled spaces, right? We lost the social commons. So here we have a metaverse. We have the opportunity to create a new space, an escapist space, or a space for more, or we can put it into positive frameworks. But no social commons. How can we create a social commons in the metaverse?
People are trying hard to create social commons in the metaverse. I mean, right now, a lot of corporations are run by, a lot of the virtual worlds are run by corporations, but there are groups of users who are creating spaces. There are governments who are creating spaces. I mean, I think...
Barbados.
What's that?
Barbados.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we should certainly, I worry that the word metaverse is now, it's almost been trademarked by Meta, so that when people hear metaverse, they hear corporation. But I would like to remove that connotation for the term in the long run. I mean, people are already working on decentralized virtual worlds running off the blockchain. I hope there are metaverses created in a million different ways. I mean, maybe it's colonial. On the other hand, colonial land grabs are perhaps not quite as bad when you've got unlimited, infinite space which is created and not already inhabited. And that's what is the case with the metaverse.
I think that's a dangerous way to think about it, because I think as soon as you allow that, you start to suggest, well, like it's infinite, but maybe I'll just grab this little bit, or maybe I can just. I mean, it gets a little complicated if you want to push that as a frame of, as an encouraging frame of thought.
I do think it's a super important difference between virtual realities and physical realities. Is physical realities, by their nature, are sparse and limited. There's only so much space to go around on the Earth. There's only so many resources. You build a house, and it's a lot of work to build another one, whereas digital realities are not limited in anything like the same way. You build one house, you can just do that, build a new house, build a new planet. I mean, yes, there are costs, but there's a kind of abundance there.
The imagination is abundant too, and yet what permits the imagination is a social narrative storytelling. And I sort of want to get a little bit, if I may now, at some of the work you've done around like having a publishing company that tells indigenous stories, and the sort of, the need for these comics that tell this other type of narrative than Superman.
Right.
Because that's world building too.
Absolutely. And I wanted to just tag one last thing, because we talked about this in terms of like objects and the things like that, is even as we're having this conversation, there are still millions of people that cannot access the metaverse. When we're talking about the reservation, there is no broadband in many of these locations. This is traditional homeland in these spaces. There is no signal down in the valley, right? There's no spaces. So there's still a lot of people, as much as we're talking about this type of thing, there's still places where this can't go. I can pause that. Publishing, though, I think it does speak to, when we talk about that, it is talking about how are we reorienting this narrative around, creating superheroes and markers for marginalized communities, and especially indigenous communities, and tying us back to that, imaginative, socialized space, right? We have told star stories and space rangers that we see on the walls of the canyons for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years from our indigenous Australian folks, right? So we can go back even farther. These are the stories that have been told. And so where did, I guess as we talk about the metaverse, and let's bring it back to that, where are those? Where is that in terms of this formulation of these narratives that are developed, right? How do you develop a narrative in a space that is infinite, that is abundant, that has no strife, that has any of this utopic space, right? How do you develop a narrative over millennia in these types of spaces, when people are going into this and not connecting to these ways, right? So I think our work in terms of publishing and these, especially from indigenous voices, which have so not been a part of any of the conversation, and tying back to this is, again, who is telling the story and how is the story being created? I think that's the fundamental question that we asked at the beginning. Who's telling the story? How is that story being created? Because we're not making the AI and we're not doing the coding, right? And we're coming along at it later on to try and make it more equitable, to try and make what the vision of it could be in terms of a lot of, communities that are looking at this, and indigenous folks that are into the AI, into the AI verse, into the VR verse, the AR verse, and all the technological pieces that are coming together to make up the metaverse. Just for me, I got into it because I just like superheroes, and I wanted to see myself as a superhero. So that was cool, right? That was the main thing, so I can wear cool bling.
I think one of the other things that I maybe want to add on to this is the way in which architecture, as well as different kinds of environments, produce different types of thinking, right? There's plenty of psychological studies on how architectures influence thought, right? Light and so forth. But that's also true in physical environments, right? Like I lived in Santa Fe for 6 years, right? And like mountain desert does something different for my thinking than when I am in New England, right? In the sort of like the canopy of trees, right? Which is very different from being on an ocean beach, right? Like these are different, I will say, at least for myself, it literally produce different kinds of thought, right? There are times in my life when I'm thinking through things, I need that. We have that impulse when we know, like, I need to go for a walk, right? You need a different physical environment. And one of the things that I'm just wondering is, yes, we talk about that so much in terms of visual, but it's also sensorial. It's about the way the space actually feels on your skin and the smell and the rest of it. And I'm wondering, what are we pretending the metaverse will offer in terms of that? And because I do believe that you cannot stuff the genie back in the bottle, right? The metaverse is here. We're going to have these virtual realities. It's not going anywhere. So what I always try and look for is to think, okay, can we split up where it's productive, where it's useful, and pull back from where it's confusing, it's layering confusion. How can we have, and this is to you obviously, like how can we have a metaverse that does certain types of spatial orientations in order to really re-engage with this?
I think first and foremost, we have to pinpoint where the initial confusion is. And my question is, why have we confused the prison for freedom? And I just want to touch on something that David said, which I asked him what he meant when he said we give consciousness to things, and he said subjectivity is consciousness. Is subjectivity consciousness? I'm just going to throw some questions out there. Is subjectivity a symptom of separation? In order to have subjectivity, it's subject and object. There's a duality there. Are we confusing unconsciousness for consciousness? And is that the illusion in itself? And is that what's steering us down this rabbit hole? So, I don't think technology is bad at all. I don't think the metaverse is bad at all. All tech is doing is amplifying the confusion that we already have in us. And if we're going to navigate these worlds with any kind of discipline and responsibility, we have to clean this up. Because we are approaching a tipping point, like the natural environment, climate change. If we cross this threshold, we'll never go back to what the world was. The same thing with our inner environment. With technology and what's coming, if we don't clean this up, we will reach a tipping point where we will not be able to return to what it means to be human. So to answer that question about the confusion and how do we navigate this for the future, I don't think we can look at what the metaverse can do and what can we do in the metaverse or how should we program it differently. It all comes from, you cannot separate the creation from the creator. We have to get this right first.
Yeah, on subjectivity, I guess, I think, what is it? I am me, and you are you, and, we're different people, and that's okay, but also we are we. So we have not just subjectivity, but intersubjectivity, and a whole lot of the meaning is created, I think, intersubjectivity by us as a community. I think it's a collective project. It's not an individual project. We as communities bring meanings to our worlds. I guess I don't think necessarily the metaverse has to be a prison. I mean, the Earth might look like a prison on the scale of the cosmos. Here we are on this tiny planet. Looks no better than being on a microchip. But
And that's why some people want to go to Mars.
Right, but we've managed to bring meaning to this microchip, this pathetic little microchip that we've got in some corner of the galaxy and a corner of the universe. And look at all the meaning that we've come to give it. That it's built, the traditions, the communities. I mean, we've done that with the physical world, and yes, we're on the point of messing it up, and we can't mess it up, and we've got to. Keep the meaning that we have there. And I think, but exactly the same is true for virtual worlds. We could easily mess them up in all kinds of ways by, imposing the wrong kind of pathological social structures on these virtual worlds as we have in the physical world. I think again we collectively have to figure this out in the physical world, so we don't mess up the physical world, and likewise we've got to collectively figure out how we treat these digital worlds, so we don't mess either of them up.
I think there's sorry, I didn't mean to. I was like, yes, that's a great point. And I'm going to use the microphone to point that out. I think there's also something that goes back to, I think it's a question for me, is in this space, in the metaverse, how do we, because you're right, it's out of the bag, how do we bring wonder to that space? All of the things that I think we're doing potentially right now in the metaverse are just digital versions of the analog. It's a way to communicate. It's another way to have a conversation over a long distance. And we can fly, but you don't have the physical sensation of that. Even when you have the goggles and it's all below you, I get all dizzy. I was like, I can't do that because I got, all the vertigo and everything. So how do you capture the same wonder? And we were talking about this at the beginning, when you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon. How does the metaverse do that when, with the snap of a fingers, I can change that viewpoint? Because if we have no rules that we're bound by in the metaverse. I can pass through somebody, I can be upside down, I can become a giant, right? If there are no rules in that space, how do we come back to eliciting wonder, which I think is an amazing part of our amazing facet of our identity, our humanness, our human identity. So I think that's a question. I don't have an answer for that, but that's a question I think that also needs to be answered, is how do we bring wonder into the metaverse? I don't know if it's there yet.
I would never want to bring wonder to a hammer.
Right. Right.
No, a hammer is a tool. Mm-hmm. See, the moment you bring wonder to the metaverse, the tool becomes the reality. The moment wonder, mystery goes into a virtual world, you risk to asphyxiate the urge and the necessity to discover wonder and mystery in the natural world. So wonder, if we give the metaverse wonder, we are merely putting baits to draw us deeper into the prison. I would like to see a metaverse that functions as a tool, not as a place of false wonder, and I'll just end it there, sorry.
Did you want to answer?
Yeah, I got to come in on this, because I love wonder and mystery, and there is so much of it in the natural world, and it's amazing. But I don't think wonder and mystery have to just be the province of the providence of the natural world. I mean, there's wonder and mystery in the social world, just as much wonder and mystery in the social world as there is in the natural world. There's wonder and mystery in the scientific world, and I think there's wonder and mystery in the technological world. I mean, the last 50 years of dealing with digital technology, I mean, it's brought some awful things, but it's also brought some wondrous things. The internet is wondrous in so many ways. I can just, talk to my family in Australia and meet people who make connections I've never made before. So I think there's wonder and mystery in digital worlds just as there is in the natural world. We shouldn't be afraid of, all the forms of wonder and mystery.
But
I need to respond to that.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, because there's a bunch of things. I mean, I think one of the problems is, people have different notions of wonder, and so I wonder if I can.
Is wonder subjective?
Well, what I was going to suggest is if we remember that the metaverse is a design space, a virtual world is a design space, I think that helps position why it is you're talking about it as a tool. Because design spaces engage with you in mostly a goal-oriented fashion, right? The point is to produce certain types of behavior, certain types of engagements. And so I think maybe that's part of this tool thing that's coming up. And one of the things I've noted is I'm not sure we can daydream in virtual reality. So to move it out of wonder into this realm of, daydreaming is something about how can I daydream in a design space, right? And so maybe if we think about the metaverse as a design space, we can see how it's tooling us.
It's a manipulated wonder. I think the way that it is currently created is that it's manipulated because there's still an underlying part that still goes back to who controls it, who has access, how is it being supported, et cetera, et cetera. There's still a monetization that goes with it, a gamification goes with it. And so it's a manipulated wonder. I think there is wondrous things that happen, but it also takes the introspection of understanding that it's a tool. I think that's the key, right? Like understanding of being like, I know it's cool to be able to talk to friends, but I have to take the moment to be wondrous of that. And not just being like, we can just do, this is just a thing now, right?
It's not wondrous is the first time I saw a boardroom in the metaverse. Why do I want to be at a boardroom table?
And you didn't have legs, right?
No wonder.
So there was a discussion here last night, and the woman said she creates simulations. And she said, what's wrong with a simulation? It's all a simulation. So we just create more simulations. And I'm all for wonder in technology. I'm all for wonder in the metaverse. I think that's fine. Here's the problem. The moment a simulation is better than the real thing is a sure sign you have not experienced the real thing. Because there is a dimension beyond thought that is so deep it shatters all simulations. And until we realize that, we better keep wonder out of the metaverse. Sorry.
Just say we discover that some people think that actually all this is a simulation, that we're inhabiting a giant simulation right now. It turns out the Grand Canyon is part of the simulation, and Yellowstone is part of the simulation, and we're part of the simulation. Does that mean that all this suddenly, becomes meaningless? It's a mere simulation? I think the Grand Canyon is just as awesome as it ever was, and Yellowstone is just as awesome as it ever was, even if it turns out this is a digital world as part of some other world. So I don't think, that something being a simulation suddenly renders it meaningless. Look how wondrous and mysterious simulations can be.
I agree.
There may be something beyond the simulation, on the other hand, in which case I'm all for knowing that too.
Just put the warning out. When awe for technology replaces awe for nature, you're in for a ride. And we are on that path right now. and we better wake up. Not much time left.
I guess if I can just take a more middle-of-the-road approach, which I sort of alluded to a little bit earlier, I do think there are distinctions to be drawn between life in a virtual reality and a life in this tangible reality. I think that that's a useful thing. One of the things that concerns me about the hyper-realism that's being brought out in the metaverse has to do with the way in which and let's remember, it's so not there, right? You are very clearly not in this world, so we're not at the Matrix yet, right? But it's
That's what they want you to think.
Fair. But, you know, I think about it often as part of our challenge right now is this hybrid reality. It's the way in which this goes with us everywhere, and something like this is just going to become more so, right? We are at the launch of this kind of hybrid existence. And this brings up all kinds of issues of metaphysics and so forth, and I'll just put a pause on that. But I think what I maintain is the fact that they are two distinct realms that overlap. And so I think about them as a Venn diagram. And what worries me is that we keep thinking about the middle space where they overlap as being the only space, the only way of thinking about it. And one of the reasons I brought up daydreaming is I think it's really nice to remember, oh, daydreaming is something that only happens in this human place. I can't do that over there. Okay, maybe there's this other thing that actually just does really, really well in the technological space, right? Like it's just designed to do that really, really well. And as I start to be able to parse, I start to be able to maybe do the kind of thinking that, John, you're asking us to do, right? To become aware of where am I bringing things over here into this portion of the Venn diagram that don't need to be over there. They actually are just simply better here. And what actually maybe is better over here, and to recognize that. And so I guess I want to ask each of you, can you identify things that are just simply, better, one side of the Venn diagram, like the virtual world or the tangible world, are better over there in that space? And what does that mean for recognizing what it means for the other side? Wonder, John?
Okay,
Go ahead.
So, we have the virtual world and the tangible world, okay? We have perceptions of those worlds. Could it be that our addiction to the virtual worlds is because we're perceiving the tangible world in a lifeless way? And so we're relying on third parties to bring color to our realities. If that's the case, then we are projecting, and I'll just say, for lack of a better word, we are projecting boredom over our tangible reality and consume virtual realities to make us less bored. But both are programs. I'm doing a program of boredom that makes me see the world boring. So I consume someone else's program. Both of those landscapes, the digital and that tangible, are housed in a program. And until we get off all programs and see reality for what it is, we will want to be consumed by virtuality. So the Venn diagram thing, if I'm understanding it right, those are two circles within the same dimension of consciousness. And if we don't transcend that, we will be consumed by it.
I like your example of daydreaming, And actually, your example of boredom, too, because sometimes I think that, sometimes we do daydream with technology. Actually, social media is arguably the new daydreaming, right?
I would call that zoning out. I think it's different.
Daydreaming and zoning out are pretty deeply continuous, at least in my experience. So you're kind of swiping through your Facebook or your Instagram feed, and it's a little bit like, not so different from daydreaming, but it is technologically mediated daydreaming. It is one of these cases where, maybe it's not entirely healthy, because this is daydreaming, which is actually being manipulated by a source outside you. A lot of the work is being done by Meta or whoever's controlling the algorithm for your newsfeed. And I would say this is a genuine form of daydreaming. It's daydreaming with one's extended mind. The phone extends our mind in so many ways, whether it's remembering things for us or planning things for us, and here, daydreaming for us. But you don't want to outsource your mind entirely to corporations like Meta. So I think this is a place where we just have to make sure that the technology, for example, enhances our creativity and doesn't replace our creativity. Otherwise, if Meta ends up doing all our thinking for us, then we die a little. Then we die a little inside. But I think you can see so many places where technology is used to make people creative, to make people think, not to get in the way of their thinking. And I would just hope that the ways in which technology works for us for good is when it enhances our creativity and enhances our consciousness rather than disabling those things.
So I think it's a good question, because it makes me think, and it's also binaristic, right? Because if we're thinking of the Venn diagram, it's really it should be like a rose petal diagram, right? Like all the things, the nuances. But to boil it down, I'm kind of working through this, is that the pluses and the minuses revolve around, for both of them, and we're going to pick just two for this for this overlap, is struggle and not struggle in my mind, right? So the thing that for going back to that first question, meaningfulness, the struggle builds meaning. It builds the story. And I struggle with what's the story in a metaverse where you have no struggle. And I mean that in the sense of, I watch, kiddos and folks that I work with, you can build anything in Minecraft. And Minecraft is the kids' metaverse, right?
And Roblox.
You can build anything, or Roblox, yeah. You can build anything, you can do anything. And the kids grinding, right? The whole idea of grinding. Well, I just got to do this over and over and over and over and over again. But there's no struggle in it, because you just turn it on. You're not pressing buttons anymore. You're not doing anything. You've got a little alt command that goes in there, and it becomes so repetitive, right? And there's something to that. We can say that there's grinding in the real world, and you're mining and doing all these other things, but there's the physical nature of that struggle creates something different than a digital verse of that. The flip of that is that there is no struggle, and that allows other people to be able to come in who have struggled or are struggling outside of the metaverse. If it's not all consuming, I look at, our folks, differently abled folks. In the metaverse, I can now not have to struggle with whatever has bound me in this space that has been, something that has limited me. I can fly, I can walk, I can talk, I can communicate. And so there's a difference in that space, but it's still that center point in the Venn diagram, I think, is around how do we tell the story in that, right? So even for the folks that have struggled, they're telling a different story in the metaverse, but that story of struggle, that story of challenge, overcoming obstacles, I think is the key component to this and creates both sides of that, and I think ties us back to our humanity.
It's across the different answers, I kept thinking about these stories and information and meaning. And interestingly, it made me think about how last summer, in July 2021, not the Attorney General, sorry, but our nation's doctor, what is he called?
Surgeon General.
The Surgeon General, thank you. The Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, came out with the Surgeon General's warning against misinformation. And it was the first time that the Surgeon General had ever produced a warning that wasn't about a physical substance, gas, water, food, right? And it was remarkable to me, and part of the reason that the Surgeon General did this was misinformation was creating physical illness, right? It was contributing to a pandemic. And I've been thinking about this because some of what we're circling around is, this idea of meaning, this idea of whose story is being told, what information do we have about the worlds that we're going into. And I'm struck by the fact that if the Surgeon General at this stage in 2021 could identify the need for a warning against misinformation, just in the same way, and we may all have many issues with the FDA, but in the same way that the FDA does certain types of oversight around what kind of food and drugs can come to market, right? Is there maybe a growing need to check what information is being proposed by these virtual realities, right? Because they are moving so quickly, we don't have generations to think through the socio-political developments that they're presenting to us, right? And so I guess, it's a strange way, but in terms of meaning, and just to bring it back to what can we do, what can we begin to think about, is that potentially an option?
I think this is especially going to be a worry when it comes to the growing technology of augmented reality, which of course John is an expert with, which is going to be providing an informational overlay for the physical world around us, where virtual reality puts you in a headset and cuts you off from the physical world. Augmented reality projects virtual things into the physical world, and one of the primary things it projects is information. It's not just information. Maybe we might be able to project, say, a virtual piano into the world that one can somehow play, but an awful lot of what it projects is information. Maybe there'll be a little face recognition system that's going to, give me a name over everybody's head, so I automatically,
know
recognize people.
Is.
Exactly. Maybe there's going to be, navigation. Maybe there's going to be numbers. It's all, a huge amount of this is going to be information, and we're going to have this layer of information in our heads. We're going to suddenly be informational omnivores who know so much more than we did before, thanks to this extension of ourselves through augmented reality. But of course, it raises the question: just as we had corporations manipulating our social media algorithms, and thereby manipulating our daydreaming, maybe they're going to be manipulating our information into, for example, misinformation. If you think misinformation is a problem now, wait till it's in effect, as if these corporations can reach into your extended mind. And
there is a Black Mirror episode about this.
I find it, I guess, amusing, but sadly amusing or horribly amusing that a colonial endeavor is giving us a warning about colonization, essentially, right? Which is the last space that has been left to colonize on Terra is the space inside our heads. Right? Everything else has been taken. It's been occupied by somebody. It's been claimed by somebody. And in this space, all that's left is this little bit of real estate that we have. And the Surgeon General comes out and says, we should probably be aware of people that are doing that while they're doing that, saying, and we're going to put rules on who's going to be able to do this and when they're going to be able to do this, and that strikes me as such a conflict of interest, a paradox, a very, troubling state of affairs. That I think that's something that we're really also going to have to wrap around in terms of where this is going. I don't know if I have much more to add. It just started to strike me as really funny that the Surgeon General is making these statements, and what kind of rules are we going to put on who gets to colonize, but you're the one that's making the rules, so you're structuring that to begin with after you've already done all of this stuff and taken all these spaces.
On that note, excuse me, the last space to colonize is the human soul. And that is what's on the line right now. And that's why they're getting into our brains, and that's why they're distracting us from our connection to our humanity and to the nature around us. I do want to say something, comment. David spoke about augmented reality and how we'll be wearing these lenses. And you'll walk around and you'll have these like overlays. Something very interesting right now, well, it's advanced, but when augmented reality in its most basic form, what it does is it takes a virtual image and projects it over the natural world, okay? Now, that virtual image is always on top of nature. It's always on top of the physical. There's now something called object occlusion. And what that means is you could be wearing glasses and you see a digital creature running around. That digital creature can now run behind physical objects. Your glasses know which is the physical reality. And so the digital now goes behind the physical. When that happens, when the digital is behind the natural, it looks like the device is projecting the natural. So there's a flip of ground. And it's a little abstract, but I would say, be careful with that.
The part that I think that I love what we're doing up here is I find that both simultaneously really cool and also terrifying. I think that's why we're in this space, is why we come out to have these conversations. Is I was like, you're explaining it, and I was like, that sounds awesome. And also, oh no, that sounds horrific. And I'm just floored by that.
Well, so that's what all of this is. That is the trajectory.
Right.
They are trying to swap your ground. The technological singularity is the swapping of the spiritual omega point. Just be careful what they're inversing. We have to stay aware.
I mean, technology can help us appreciate nature. Even if you just, you come out and you're bird watching with, binoculars or something, then already that's kind of augmenting your appreciation of nature. Or here's something I quite like to do. Interesting way to think of this one. When the fall colors come along, I like to go for a drive. And the colors are pretty good, but you put on some rose-colored sunglasses. Those fall colors are amazing. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. Now, is that wrong because it's unreal? But hey, all of these colors were projected by your mind in the first place. So if technology can enhance your appreciation of what's going on in nature, it needn't be a bad thing. Especially if you know what's really going on in nature. I would hope that augmented reality, yes, sometimes it can overlay nature, sometimes it can hide nature, but sometimes it could enhance nature. I'd like to think your uses of augmented reality here are helping us appreciate nature.
Definitely. I think the thing with the binoculars is the binoculars don't become a reality. It's hard to make the binoculars reality. It's always a tool. I'm not going to make a hammer my reality. But we're creating worlds that are replacing reality. And that, I feel, is the danger. And we have to keep them in their proper tool space. And my use of technology in this exhibition is so that it serves as that tool function.
I'm curious what you think about books. We've been creating worlds for a long time that kind of in some ways replace the physical world. Or books, fictions, are they dangerous in the same way?
Oh no, and I think imagination is wonderful. It's all about the power that we give to it. I mean, the metaverse could be a wonderful thing, but if we give it the power of reality, we have a problem on our hands.
And it's not controlled by anyone else. The landscape is still set in a virtual reality. You programmed this, right? At the end of the day, you use something that was programmed. In a book, I am still the only one that can program what that fiction looks like. right? It's why we have so many different views, even as, you know, as deliberate as someone is going to write that fiction, being like, and it was four steps
You're
forward.
the one creating the fiction, so it's true for you. But if
Absolutely.
if I'm consuming your fiction, then,
You still change that. I still create it, but you change that. And I don't think you can do that in a virtual world. Like, I don't think you can do that because at the end of the day, it is so visually oriented, it can't be restructured by your imagination from a fictionalized account, because the words, you're processing words based on all of your social constructs. So when you read a paragraph, you're experiencing that paragraph based on everything that you've experienced up to that point. And so you create the new construct that comes in from all of your social interactions, from your own self, identification, all those pieces. Whereas when I have it right in front of me, because it is so object-oriented in the glasses themselves, that is set and pre-programmed for me already out the gate, and I don't have necessarily a differing experience because I'm not processing the abstract nature of words to images to identity to being able to then subsequently communicate that.
So you think we can bring our own meaning to a novel, graphic novel, and so on, but we can't bring our own meaning to a virtual world? I think the same processes by which we give meaning to a book.
I think less. I do think less. I really think it's the process. It's the same way as if you look, we talk about this with comics, is the difference between making a film and making a comic. There are psychological studies about comics is the panels and gutters, your brain does something completely different when it's not fed 35 frames per second. You have the ability to stitch together from one panel, me doing this in panel 1, to having somebody knocked out in panel 2. I make the connections between the two. That's my brain doing that. When I'm seeing it in film, it looks neat to see the punch and you see and there's still all sorts of trickery that goes with that. But 35 frames per second makes a whole different experience. And I think the virtual world is that movie. It's not that I can't have meaning from watching the movie, but I have more meaning from reading the book, from being a part of making that meaning in my own head.
So we need the right balance of reality and imagination.
I think so.
As
a tool.
I would say literary history points to the fact that when novels first came out, they talked about the problem of how they were immersive texts and that people got lost in them and that they stopped paying attention to the reality around them and they were not a part of it or attentive. They were particularly because of the way in which they had this sort of visualizing element of them, because they weren't these sort of more abstract philosophical texts, they were sort of oriented toward, like women started reading them and that it became this sort of gendered thing too. There's this interesting, as people got more used to novels and the way in which they constructed a certain type of reality and a certain type of thinking, there became greater analysis of that. We get literary theory, we get narrative theory, and so we start to be able to understand how to do close reading of the text. The same argument starts to appear then with film. The language is slightly different. You get fascination as the term in film theory around the same sort of issues. But once you teach people how to read cinematography, how to read film cuts, and how to read camera angles, you get people who can suddenly articulate what it is that's happening to them as they're experiencing the 35 frames per second much better. One of the things that I think I'm trying to get at is the way in which, as these new technologies appear, part of the challenge is about educating the recipient on what it is that they're experiencing and what it is that it is doing to them, right? We are still at the stage of having to understand what this virtual reality is, and it's appeared before we barely began to understand what it is that the screen is doing to us and what social media as like a step into these virtual spaces is doing to us. So part of, I think, the challenge, and this is where I think you are right, is that the accelerationist relationship to technology doesn't give us social time to begin to think through and to theorize and to process and to discern and to decide what it is that this space is doing and make choices around it, right? I am just aware of time.
That was a great, I just want to say that was a great point. The time pressure now, the inability of the time's moving so quickly. that we don't have the time now to even really analyze what it's doing to us. And that's where I think government is failing us miserably, on putting in the right boundaries to how fast this machine is moving. Because we need more time to figure this out.
And it's complicated because I think, to your point, I mean, also government was the one, was this colonizing influence that is now trying to be the one who's going to save us from this other colonizer, right? So we're in this sort of weird moment around this. We need to wrap this up so that they can ask us questions too.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, you know, I think one of the things that all of you have expressed is that the question isn't, can there be meaning in the metaverse? If in no simple part, we are meaning-making creatures, there is meaning in the metaverse, both by those who design it and by those who are going into it. So really what's at stake is greater conversations and more articulation about how that meaning is being produced, who is producing the meaning, from what backgrounds, from what positionalities, if you will. And that is really the conversation that we need to be asking, not if it can be there, but how is it there? And with that, I'm not quite sure who is responsible for the Q&A, but I want to give you all a chance to contribute some meaning-making inquiries.
I think we have some people with microphones or not. Here we go, yep.
Okay, cool. Hi, thank you for having this conversation, first of all. So I think it's easy to take the ominous route when talking about these I'm back here, by the way, sorry. Yeah, I think it's like easy to take the ominous route when talking about the metaverse or immersive technologies, and especially thinking about our current relationship with social media, it's easy to think about, you know, the next level negative effects of these things, and also realizing that we're at a pivotal moment with this stuff. And this moment is really important in making big decisions. So I first have like a general question, so you can like ponder it, and I have like 2 quick examples after I ask the question. But I think when we talk about this next level relationship and how we need to get it right, there needs to be a North Star for people to build towards. It's easy to talk in abstracts, so like what is this North Star that we should build towards in terms of a complementary relationship between the physical world and the digital world when it comes to these immersive technologies? So that's my question. I think 2 quick examples to help this conversation is I was talking to someone recently, and he was discussing how one of the original use cases for virtual reality was for astronauts. And so they would do the training within VR, and of course the end goal is in the physical world so that they can go to the moon. So this notion of right now social and immersive social and reality technologies are kind of designed right now to keep you in place. So with this next thing with the metaverse, like what moon is it trying to help us reach? Like that type of goal. And the second one is this notion of forced solitude, this conversation of us needing boredom and everything like that. I definitely agree in a lot of ways. And I didn't grow up religious or anything, but like this notion of Sundays being a day of rest. And is there a world where, like, on something like Sundays or certain times of the night where there's, like, forced collective time away from digital media? Just would like to hear your, like, ideal thoughts on a complementary relationship between the two.
I'm just going to, what struck me about at least the first example, I think what we're doing right now is the moon shot. I think we have to have these conversations. I think it's this deep, insightful meaning-making that is going to allow us to, you know, look at, you know, the universe or whatever we're going to be doing with the moon. And I know lots of people that say, like, shouldn't go there in the first place. A lot of indigenous folks that are like, this is where we're from, et cetera. You know, different panel. I think, though, that this is the struggle, and we have to have these conversations. The VR is about our humanity. It's about where we are going to be in the future. It's not that, you know, that was a tool to get to the moon. This is a tool to get us to understand what this future is going to look like in a, you know, in the middle of climate chaos, in the middle of all of these things. We have to have these deeper conversations so that we remember as a whole who we are. I think that's my answer to that one example.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's going to be a single North Star that we're building towards. I mean, there may be many North Stars. If someone said 30, 40 years ago, what's the North Star that the internet should be building towards? I don't know. There's not one. There's not one glorious goal or project for the internet, like land somebody on the moon. It's like the internet has been so many things and so many amazing things, so many goals. So I guess when it comes to virtual worlds, I mean, we could point to a few exemplars or stories or conceptions, say from science fiction, from literature, from tradition. But I think of these things as being, well, the philosopher Robert Nozick talked about a meta-utopia, many different forms of utopia. Different people will have different goals and utopias for them. So I don't think we should be trying to find like a single utopia, a single North Star here that defines the metaverse for all of us.
I don't think the North Star is something that can be built. And that star is in us. And I feel that, I mean, come on, what is happening on this, first of all, I think it's a great time to be alive. I think some of the issues that this metaverse thing is bringing up is so great because it begs us to go inside. The mirror, it's not just a mirror, a reflection of us, it's a caricature of all of our inner artifice. And look at yourself as an avatar. It is a caricature of you. I mean, it's hilarious, the stuff we talk about, the metaverse and the things that are going on there. It's just like slapstick comedy. But anyway, I think as far as sort of the thing to build, if you're standing at an ocean, or if you're at a beach, there are sort of three positions you can be in. You can be floating in the water on a raft, and the current is taking you. You're not aware of the current. With a little bit of awareness, you can be knee-deep in the water. You have your feet on the sand. You feel the current. You're aware of the current. And then there's another positioning which is out of the water completely, and you're just observing it all. If it's about building something for the future, to sort of contrast where it is that we're going, the human now, generally speaking, is floating on a raft, unaware of where the current is pulling them, unaware that there's even a current. Can we, with a little bit of awareness, move to a position where we get maybe 1 foot grounded and maybe 2 feet grounded? And one way to do that is this. The next time you reach for your phone, if you can remember, wait, am I reaching for this because I'm bored or because I actually need to do something on this thing? That little thing is the seed for something really, really big.
I guess if I can just add to that, I would say if there were a North Star that I would like to introduce, and I do think there should potentially be many, it would be that the virtual space is a design space, it's an anthropocentric space. And if we can make the virtual world be the anthropocentric space so that we can, over here in the tangible world, have greater recognition and appreciation of all species and the planet, that would be a cool North Star for me.
Hi. So a question concerning the status of the reality of virtual objects. And Dr. Chalmers, I'm partly responding to your paper, The Virtual and the Real. So as I understand that paper, you're arguing that along certain axes, it's reasonable to consider virtual objects to be real. It's real in certain ways as objects that we would consider really real in the real world. I'll try to use the word real less. particularly certain types of virtual experiences, like the virtual experience of red you talk about. An object that's virtually red is almost indistinguishable from, an object that you perceive virtually as red is almost indistinguishable from an object that you perceive as red in physical reality. So there are many ways in which things that we experience in virtual reality seem to us to be real, and I think that your framework that you establish for considering these objects to be really real, I find it elegant, internally consistent, and intuitive. That said, one criticism you could make is that it's not necessarily forcefully persuasive or mandatory to adopt, as I think some of the discussion that we've seen here on the panel demonstrates. And one of the most important ways that you can consider an object real or not is not just the way people individually interpret it, but whether that reality is recognized in existing legal frameworks of property rights, for example. So in what sense do you have ownership over your virtual property? In what sense are virtual experiences considered to be real experiences as considered by the law? An extremely important and controversial topic that's emerging lately is, for example, whether virtual sexual assault should be considered to be a crime on the order of sexual assault in the physical world. So I'm wondering if you or any of the other panelists have recommendations for in a sense that goes beyond people's individual approaches to virtual reality, which can be individual, but so can people's individual approaches to real reality. The law doesn't care. They will send policemen to arrest you regardless of your personal approach to it. If you have any thoughts on the way the law needs to adapt to rule on the reality of virtual objects, either say that they are and in what sense, or that they're not and in what sense, and if they're going to leave it ambiguous, it kind of defaults to corporate governance by whatever private entities or whatever entities generally govern the metaverses.
Well, you're well prepared. Read an article of mine from 2017, the virtual and the real, where I argued that virtual objects are real objects. Actually, some of this I followed up in a book I published earlier this year called Reality Plus, which is all about the reality of virtual worlds, including pushing it in some of those directions. Partly, I try to expand the idea that virtual objects can be real and meaningful. But yeah, some of these questions about how the ethics of virtual worlds should work and how the laws in virtual worlds should work are really important. You mentioned the case of property possession. Can there be theft in a virtual world? There was a case where somebody was accused of stealing someone's virtual treasure in a virtual world, and they tried to defend them by saying, "I can't have stolen anything. It wasn't really an object there to steal. It was just a fictional thing." And I guess a judge in the Netherlands actually ruled that this really was a case of theft. You deprive this person at least of a digital possession, which is real. So that's a case of, I think, the law moving in the direction that it has to move in to acknowledge the reality of virtual objects. And some of the same issues come up for virtual bodies. I mean, maybe digital bodies right now, avatars, they have significant meaning to the people who inhabit them in virtual worlds. I wouldn't say they yet have the same full-scale meaning that our physical bodies have for us. I mean, that level of identification and so on. So maybe virtual sexual assaults aren't exactly, shouldn't be treated exactly the same way as physical sexual assaults, but they shouldn't be treated as nothing either. And I think things are very much moving in that direction to realize that these events involving one's virtual body can be really genuinely traumatic for people. And to me, that just supports the idea that what happens inside virtual worlds is real, it's meaningful, it's serious, and it's not to be taken lightly.
Hi, my name is Michael. This has been really interesting, so thank you. My question is there something inherently meaningful about being in the physical world? Because I think that's kind of one of the essential questions here. Is there something inherently meaningful about being able to daydream and not just be swiping through TikTok or Instagram? Is there something about that that is like so deeply human, something that connects to the idea of the soul that we don't really have any evidence to point to, but we just like know that it's like so important to being humans? My hunch is yes. I feel like there's something that we lose when we decide to FaceTime or text our friends instead of doing the difficult thing of setting up time to meet up and maybe having some awkward silence or just awkward moments during the physical meetup. I think there's something we lose when we work from home, and it's nice to be able to have everything right there we need, but we don't go through the long commute or just the being at the office and the itchy suit. Like, I think there's something that we lose, and I just don't know like where the evidence is that we can point to and say that we're losing it. But I just know that maybe the burnout and the depression, the anxiety, maybe there is a correlation there.
I think part of it, at least from both my own personal perspective and I will say a generalized indigenous perspective, is the meaning or the meaning making comes from the stories. You don't tell a story about swiping. You don't tell a story about that interaction. You tell a story about going to work. You tell a story about what happened, and that story, in my mind, is what you're formulating around the memory that you've created around that. I can point to, I get a list of things from kids of what they've done in a virtual world, right? They've built this thing, and they're very pleased by that. And so they're actually, in some ways, I say that's an advantage. I say that they are constructing a story out of that experience. I think one of the things that happened to us in the pandemic is that we all ended up with the same story for a little while, right? And so it was really hard to be able to share that and interact in those stories, that story connection. It was just like, so what'd you do? I was inside again today. Yeah, this is great. I walked to the other end of the house today, and then I walked back to this side today. And so the story connections and the things that make meaning for all of us is really how do we connect all of our stories in this web of intersection, right? I think there's reasons why we have deep meaning around spiders and spider webs and these things in nature that we see, that we reflect on ourselves for. And I think that it is. I think that story making is that meaning making. And I think that is not, from my perspective, is not as present in a virtual world, although it can be. But I think that, even in that, it's the reflective pieces about connecting up with your friends afterwards. Like you play a game or you do something about, you do the debrief. You talk about like, oh man, remember when I did that? Oh man, remember when that happened? That's, I think, the piece around the meaning making, the memory making, and that imaginative exploration, because it's a social engagement. It's the story making and a social engagement. So I think.
Just on that, thank you for that, by the way. I'm just going to throw out a question. If you were meaning itself, and all of this was meaning itself, would you need to create meaning? That's one question. Or would you serve that meaning?
I think we can probably do one more question.
It's two questions, but if they don't fit, we can just get to the first one. The first one's for Chalmers and the second one's for Mack. And it was building upon what you said earlier about bodies, virtual bodies, or bodies in virtual spaces not having the same scale or like significance. And I was wondering about relationships in that sense, perhaps romantic or friendships with virtual characters that are not avatars of a person that exists in the world. So, what is the video game term? NPC, as it were. And what you think about that. And the second one is for John Mack. Again, if we don't have time, I understand. But you seem very concerned about reality, and you mentioned a couple of things about, something like we're giving the metaverse the power of reality, and if we are able to see reality for what it is and such. So I'm just wondering what exactly you're calling reality or what that means to you.
Yeah, the case of yeah, NPCs in a virtual world is interesting. I guess I would say that right now, the NPCs that you find in current virtual worlds, non-player characters, which don't correspond to, say, a biological being, using them in a headset or a computer, but instead there's just creatures purely of the algorithm. I guess I say right now NPCs are not conscious beings, they're just algorithms. And therefore I'd say, they don't have rights, they don't have genuinely meaningful lives. Maybe they could occasionally be meaningful to a conscious being interacting with them, but not in the way that another conscious being is. On the other hand, in the future, as artificial intelligence technology develops, I think it's entirely possible that we'll eventually have AI systems that are conscious, that are people. I mean, this was actually got illustrated in the, I don't know how many of you saw the movie Free Guy, with Ryan Reynolds and Jodie Comer, where, Ryan Reynolds is actually a non-player character in a video game world in this movie, and then Jodie Comer is a player character who comes down and interacts with him, but he's a conscious artificial intelligence. This is made very, very clear that his life has meaning, his life has value. At one point, he discovers all this and says to his friend, does this mean that none of this is real? And his friend says, look, I'm sitting here with my best friend, trying to help him get through a tough time. If that's not real, I don't know what is. And I think, reality, again, it comes from the mind. Consciousness invests things with meaning. If NPCs eventually have conscious inner lives, they will be as able to invest their world with meaning as, say, Ryan Reynolds is in Free Guy, or as we are ultimately in the physical world. So right now, I don't think that's on a par with genuine conscious reality, but give it time and it will be.
Do we have time for the next question? Thank you. So how do I define reality? Was that your question?
Yeah, you just get very concerned with this,
Yeah.
like virtual replacing reality.
Yeah. So I'm not concerned with reality at all, because reality is going to be fine. And what I mean by that is this. The moment the human separates, you enter a virtual reality. And what I mean by that is this. In the same way that the device in augmented reality puts a digital construct between you and reality, the psyche device does the same thing. It has a program. We've been programmed since childhood, our values, our belief systems. That program is projected like a veil in front of our reality. Reality, then, in how I'm speaking about it, is a perception that is not a way of perceiving at all. It's a perception that is totally off the program. There is no projection in front of you. It is when subjectivity dies. And there is reunion. That's what I'm calling reality. Unmediated perception, correct. Pure perception. Yep. Without filter.
Well, on that note, I wish you all the best of luck with unmediated perception. But insofar as it is mediated, I guess we hope that you think about the meaning that you are both invoking and that is being given to you. That is perhaps the work at hand that we've all been expressing. Thank you very much. Good night.
All right. Thank you, everybody.